we can definitely be conscious of not needing to revisit the same stuff over and over again. Beautiful. So to start us off today, we are going to hear from Carolyn about the sort of, hold on, sorry, just give me a minute, great. We're going to get some updates and reminders and then we'll move on. I'll be back in a moment. Here's Carolyn.
So hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you on this rainy morning. And rain that was really needed. And talking about what we really need are also some docents docents for various tours. As you can see, the Frank Lloyd Wright tours tomorrow are still in need of 2 docents, one at 10:30 and one at 1 p.m. On Thursday, the 6 p.m. tour is short of a docent. You can see further Saturday for the weekend are 3 docents open, and then next week there are a few openings too. So if you have any questions, please come to me, and otherwise logistics is always there for you. Art of the Work tours. This Thursday, the new Currier Connection second floor tour, the 30-minute tour is still open. So if you feel like diving in and exploring the new installation with guests, it's a lot of fun, and it's really it's just a pleasure. It's your choice which side of the gallery you want to go. The suggestion is to do one of the 2 galleries or maybe the balcony, and include maybe the balcony, one work on the balcony outside, but it's totally your choice. The whole second floor is yours to take. So this Thursday, and then at the end of the month there is another opportunity for that kind of tour. On Saturday is Creative Studio Day, second Saturday in the month. And if one of you would feel like doing the short family tours from 10:30 to 12:30, those are still open. And then, of course, Looking Together are all taken for September. Thank you very much. They're up on the website. But the October ones are yours to take. And I don't think I have put the Art of the Work tours for October yet on logistics. That will come soon, shortly. But the Looking Together are for October. So that is that about needs. One more big request from our security team. They really asked to impress that to maintain and model for our guests a safe distance to artworks. This is the arm length rule. You, including the finger you're pointing with, is at least an arm length away from the work of art. That's about 3 feet. And please, no pointing with any objects, pens, pencils, whatever else comes to mind. So just wanted to do my be diligent and share this with you, and back to Rachel.
Perfect. Excellent. So today we're going to take a few minutes to once again talk about these exhibitions. There will be a tour form review, some time for questions, a break, and then we're actually going to spend the second hour of our day together up in the galleries, actually using some of this information in practice, so we can start to apply some of what I'm talking about and get a chance to ask more informed questions and get a little more insight into how some of this applies to our day-to-day practice in the museum. So don't worry, I won't keep you trapped here too long. And then in a little bit, we'll have a chance to actually be up on our feet, moving around. So we're going to start out with some more information about the G's Bend quilts, which are a set of recent acquisitions that are up in the museum now. These should be up until early in the new year. We don't have a fixed end date yet, but I will communicate that to you all as soon as I know. So in this sort of discussion, we're going to cover a little bit about the 5 quilts that we've acquired, discuss the additional objects available in the galleries, and also think about how to incorporate this material into our larger practice within the museum. To start out with a little bit of history about the quilts themselves, G's Bend refers to a geographic boundary. So all of these quilts come from the same town, often called G's Bend, also called Boykin in Alabama. This area has been dubbed G's Bend because it was originally a plantation site owned by a man named Joseph G. He set up his plantation in 1816 along with 18 enslaved people and dubbed it Gee's Bend because there's a bend in the river near the site. From that point onward, up until the Civil War, this was an enslaved cotton plantation. It changed hands in 1845 to a family cousin in order to help settle the debt. His name is Mark Petway, a name you'll see come up repeatedly in our presentation today. This included the enslaved individuals, and Petway actually brought an additional 100 enslaved people to the site from his own plantation in North Carolina. The lore of the area is that he forced these individuals to walk across 4 states in order to arrive at this new plantation. So 100 people that he walked with him. And these are the people who the current residents of Gee's Bend descend from. So when we're talking about the residents, the women making these quilts, we're talking about the descendants of this enslaved population who carry that meaning with them through their work and through their personal lives. After emancipation, many of the quilters took the last name Petway as part of enslavement was to deny people the right to carry a family name. So what we really do trace is a lineage across many generations, both in positive and negative ways. After emancipation, many of the same individuals actually stayed in the area and worked as sharecroppers, working the land under financially burdensome tenant leases as part of the movement away from slavery. While the sharecropping population lived in the area, the community took up subsistence living, which is to say that they made everything that they needed, largely within their own community. This part of Alabama is quite remote. It's a fairly insular community. But for much of the time, they actually had a ferry that would go to and from this area, which brought in news, different people, and other interesting pieces of information. Notably, the most isolated period for this town was when the ferry was shut down in 1962 as part of an act of voter suppression in the area. The sheriff of the town, this is unconfirmed, but is often quoted as saying, quote, "We didn't close the ferry down because they were Black. We closed it down because they forgot they were Black." Yeah. This is an area deeply embroiled in civil rights, and these quilts are part of that narrative. Even today, it remains predominantly Black, and as I mentioned, populated by families that have lived in this area for generations and carry the knowledge and stories of everything from enslavement through the emancipation, through the civil rights era up to the modern day in their quilts, in their stories, and in their family practice. Within Gee's Bend and many communities like it around the country, the relative distance to other places and the general poverty of the population required people to make what they needed. So community members took up activities like farming, they sewed clothing, they hunted, they canned food, and of course, they made quilts. Because of this, the quilts are largely made out of repurposed fabric from old shirts and flour sacks, anything that could be made new again. Everything was reused again and again to help keep the family warm and dry. One of the quilters, who was quite popular in an interview, recalled that she learned how to quilt after her marriage because there were no blankets for her and her new husband to take to their new home. The women of Gee's Bend often quilt together, creating a sense of community where family members and neighbors share knowledge and experience. Part of the joy of these quilts that we'll get to look at in just a minute is their unique patterns and colorways, something that was often passed from person to person, generation to generation. While they quilt, they sing spirituals, talk about family and community life, and discuss political problems, including, as I mentioned, the civil rights movement. This was brought to a head when Martin Luther King Jr. actually visited the area in 1965, and many of the quilters actually marched with him. Some of them were arrested for civil rights violations during protests, and they continued to voice their opposition to voter suppression both in and outside of their community. As an extension of this, the Freedom Quilting Bee was established in 1966, which is actually a collective of female quilters in the region, which allowed them to sell their own work and profit off of their labor for the first time. After a visit to this region, an Episcopal priest actually first brought these quilts to New York City, where they sold them at auction. This gave them the idea to form the collective, and after this moment, many different art dealers came into the area to buy quilts, many of whom would work with the women for many generations. Unfortunately, despite this, they were not always fairly compensated for their quilts or their time or labor put into them. This outward reach of the quilts culminated in 2002 with the Quilts of Gee's Bend, an exhibition hosted at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. It was the first of many museums and galleries that would host these really wonderful objects. The Currier has now become another in that great lineage. So it's worth asking, as I've said the word quilt way too many times already, what is a quilt? For some of you, this is going to be a review, and that's okay. But if you don't know, it's important to find out. So quilts are typically made of 3 layers, a backing piece of fabric, an internal layer of sort of puffy batting, and a cover that's heavily designed. The design is what you often think about when somebody says quilts, but really it references the full construction, all 3 layers. Some designs used on those quilt fronts are standard, and some are quite unique, but most of them are very carefully planned out. Often people will use paper patterns, where they cut out the bits of paper in the shape of fabric pieces and arrange them, and then use that as a template in order to get consistent shapes across their quilt. This is where the term patchwork comes from, and we think about quilts as being a patchwork of different fabrics. Notably, there are a huge number of standard quilt patterns, and they keep being added to every day. It's worth remembering, though, that applique is something that's a little bit different. If you see applique on a quilt, it's where you've taken a layer, another layer of fabric, and stitched 2 pieces together to add an image. What we're looking at are pieced quilts, where every piece of the quilt is actually on the same layer of fabric, and they've been sewn together at seam edges. Quilts, notably, are also anchored. To keep things from slipping around, to keep all 3 layers in line, there's stitching that goes all the way through all 3 of them, which is actually what is called quilting. The process of making that stitch pattern is the process of quilting something. These can be in a variety of different ways. They can be very functional, but they are necessary as part of the quilting process. Both that pattern on top and the quilting stitch itself can be a repeating pattern, a single large motif, or completely freeform, depending on the intention of the maker. They're all quilts. Different things have been popular in different eras, and we actually see a little bit of all of it in the gallery show as it's presented now. So we're going to start by actually looking at each of these 5 objects. You'll notice on these slides, we have a picture of the quilts. We have in the upper right-hand corner a set of images, which are the standard pattern. So I know not everybody's familiar with standard quilt blocks, so I've added in a little bit of a reference so that you can see what the quilters were basing this on and where they ended up after that. In the red box in the corner, which will be on all slides, there are some good things to take note of, and this PowerPoint will be made available to you. So if you want to go back and revisit these sort of key points for each object, please do. This quilt, made by Magdalene Wilson, is the earliest of the 5 we've acquired, made around 1925. It is composed of cotton, wool, and a little bit of silk, and is in a star variation. So we'll actually see a few stars in the gallery. There's a few in the Gee's Bend quilts, and then we actually have put a very standard star from the Currier's collection up as well, which would serve as a good point of comparison for this object. Honestly, there are many familiar quilt patterns that find a home in Gee's Bend, often with a great deal of personal abstraction. Rather than subscribing to a prescriptive set of rules, Gee's Bend quilters used African textile piecing traditions and traditional quilt patterns as guidelines, changing scale and proportion to satisfy the artistic interest of the maker. Here, Magdalene Wilson employs a traditional broken star pattern, but renders it in a striking combination of what is actually really dark blue and dark brown against the white. While perhaps not immediately obvious, the white textile in this is flour sacks, speaking to that history of repurposed fabric. This quilt is a great starting point. It's a very visual entrance to the space. And as you move on, as you move through the gallery, this one provides a great touchstone, especially when compared to this quilt. This is a different star variation by a woman named Nettie Young, made in 1937, so a little bit later. While Wilson's quilt held very strongly to that star root, as you could see with all of those points, this quilt uses an abstracted version of that star pattern. Notably, many members of the Young family worked in variations of the star in the 1930s, demonstrating that this type of quilting was really family taught. While they taught quilting, they also were able to talk about community events, build connections, and pass along family and community lore within this artistic practice. So all of that is rolled up into each of these quilted objects. The young family worked on many star patterns, eventually finding this variation from the late 1930s that really is heavily different from that first type of star quilt, but uses that piecing strategy of moving parts around to create a new effect. So take a really close look and see if you can't see a little bit of that star influence in each of these interesting blocks. As I'd said before, it's very likely that Nettie Young used paper pattern parts to help piece this together before she actually sewed it. Paper patterns are often used because you can physically pull them apart and reconstitute them by rearranging the pieces, reimagining traditional forms through playful variations on traditional themes. These quilts themselves seem to become carriers of this type of community tradition, demonstrating the passage of knowledge from parent to child and the adaptations that each generation makes to both quilting and other lifestyle traditions in the area. Geraldine Westbrook, and this object made around 1965, so a little leap forward, is a regionally popular type of pattern called housetop. Again, you can see that in the upper right-hand corner. Deceptively complex, this pattern creates inset repetitive square blocks that scale up or down to match the overall proportions of the quilt top. At its core, quilting relies on compositional geometry, layering shapes against each other on their edges to create dynamic, evocative designs through color, line, and pattern. Gee's Bend quilters, like many others, often designed their own patterns, cut their own fabrics, and laid out the pieces in iterative arrangements, seeking that moment where each piece became part of a unified whole. Westbrook and many others of the Gee's Bend quilters demonstrate a really masterful use of this housetop style to create a bold, intricate, and visually compelling piece of art. Luckily enough, we also have another housetop variation in the collection from Louisiana Bendolph, made in 2004, making it the latest quilt of the group of 5, so pretty recent. Louisiana Bendolph also works through that housetop base, but to a totally different aesthetic outcome. Made 40 years after Westbrook's variation, the same traditions of style, color work, and abstraction run strongly through the quilters of Gee's Bend, really indicating that artistic lineage that speaks to how this is a developed American art tradition. Bendolph herself describes her own joy in abstraction based on traditional forms, and she feels very strongly about how these quilts represent a critical connection between her and the women who have quilted in Gee's Bend before her. In an interview, she observed, quote, "We came from cotton fields. We came through hard times. And we look back and see what all these people before us have done. They brought us here, and to say thank you is not enough." She views her quilting as a way of paying homage and respect to the women who came before her. Notably, Bendolph did not quilt as a young woman. She was inspired to return to quilting because of the show at the Houston Art Museum. So seeing these quilts up has actually revitalized the tradition in the area and brought new people into the fold of these Gee's Bend quilts. Our final piece in the gallery is this log cabin variation from Lucia Mingo, completed around 1962. And this work really speaks to the narrative of Black creativity and art production embodied in each of these quilts. Beautiful and artistically interesting, these quilts highlight so many previously unheard stories in our galleries. This variation takes a traditional log cabin, again, you can see that pattern in the corner, and cuts it in half, utilizing that strong diagonal line to help create these sort of spilling, colorful rows across the quilt. Mingo is one of the cornerstones of the Gee's Bend quilting community. She's a 4th-generation quilter and made her first quilt at 14 years old. As a working mother, she quilted for her family and for her personal enjoyment, although she did eventually transition to quilting full-time as a teacher within the Freedom Quilting Bee. She marched in Montgomery, argued her way out of an arrest, and registered other quilters to vote. In 2015, Mingo was awarded the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. Now, at 80 years old, she doesn't quilt as much anymore, but her work has been displayed in over 20 museums across the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018. After seeing her work on display in 2002, Mingo explained, quote, "Yes, they are about history because quilts have been here all the time. But in another way, these quilts just became history because before they were hidden in the closets and on the bed mattresses. When you take them out, they become history." And that idea, that concept is at the root of this project. To recognize that the version of American art museums historically leaves out critical narratives and voices. By seeking these suppressed creative histories, we can restore a little bit more of the full story of the art of the Americas, building a better understanding of what it means for a museum and for a collection to hold American art. It's really critical not only to think about these objects as individuals and as their history sort of speaks to them, but also about how we are going to think about interpreting them in our space. So I want to give you a little bit of insight into how I think we should be discussing these quilts and what we will be doing as an interpretive strategy to highlight the important parts of these objects. So it's first important to consider how they've been talked about in the past. These quilts have been sort of, quote, discovered, unquote, many times, largely by white art collectors who've gone into this area and brought them out, ignoring the continuity that these objects have within their own community. As I mentioned before, the women who made them were very rarely given fair compensation for their time or effort. Although this has improved through the Freedom Quilting Bee, it often played on the idea that they often did not know how much these objects were ultimately selling for, undercut sometimes by as much as 100 to 500% of the final cost of these objects. When the quilts have been in museums, there are a few different ways that they are problematically interpreted, and I want to highlight 3 pitfalls to avoid in our own interpretation of these quilts. Firstly, they would often be compared to white modernists as a way to validate the quality of these artworks. We want to avoid that. We want to really highlight what's important about these objects rather than trying to associate them with other things as a way of elevating their importance. They're important all on their own. 2, the relative isolation of Gee's Bend as an area has prompted this narrative of sort of, well, what an unexpected place to find creative genius. And that really undercuts the generations of refinement of this form, the intrinsic artistic ability of these women, and the genuine enjoyment that people experience in looking at these as a piece of art. Thirdly, these objects are often compared to mediums like jazz music or improvisational music, which really, again, undercuts the planning and structure and careful piecework that goes into making a quilt. And also, once again, is really trying to equate these objects because they're both Black art forms, which is not a good way to approach it. Instead, we should be thinking about how to equate them through their artistic value, through color, line, form, rather than focusing on the idea of trying to unify the sense of Black art in the United States. So really, once again, we're going to try to let these objects stand on their own 2 feet and celebrate what is inherently wonderful about these as art pieces. So to sort of give an example, I've pulled a quote actually from the New York Times, an article published in 2002 that I think doesn't do a great job. We're going to look at this together. We're going to piece out what I don't love about it, and then we'll look at some positive examples about a different way we could approach this interpretation. So please consider the following quote. Quote, "Imagine Matisse and clay, parentheses, if you think I'm wildly exaggerating, see the show, close parentheses, arising not from rarefied Europe, but from the karmic soil of the rural South in the form of women, descendants of slaves, when Gee's Bend was a plantation." So the first thing I would like to point out is that first pitfall that I mentioned. We're equating these to Matisse and clay. This validates through comparison. Once again, really trying to point out why we should care by saying that, well, it's like other types of art we're more familiar with. And it also assumes that your population you're speaking to knows who Matisse and clay are and finds their work more important than other objects. So you're really banking on the idea that your audience shares the same opinion about modern art or this particular era of creation. So we want to avoid doing both of those things. Secondly, we're looking at the way that geography is talked about. So we're comparing rarefied Europe and the soil of the Americas, which places a priority, right? So Matisse and clay are from Europe, They have this rarefied tradition, and they get this sort of high value association placed on them. And then what we see is the Gee's Bend quilters and American makers are literally described as soil. They're being associated with dirt. So I understand that the author is trying to be poetic, but what he's doing is aligning these objects with different kinds of socioeconomic classes and in a system which is not highlighting the value of these objects. Thirdly, the author feels the need to point out that it is equally as surprising not only that this comes from the rural South, but also that the people that made them are women and descendants of slaves. So really think about, why is this information surprising? Why do we feel the need to emphasize this as being unexpected? It's framed as a contrast against what we would expect artists to come from. The reality is, and it is so important to remember, that enslaved people for hundreds of years made beautiful, artistically valuable, and emotionally impactful objects. Being from an enslaved tradition does not negate you from American art history. It includes you in it. And that's important to remember. These objects do not take us out of this tradition, they bring us further into it. I know these are long, I'll read them out to you, but these are two good examples, which will be in that PowerPoint that you can go back to and look at again. These are two that I think do a really good job of this. So I'm going to read them to you quickly. Quote, throughout history, women were making very fine textiles that were intended to highlight their artistic talents, even if they weren't shown outside the home. The women of Gee's Bend described creating the quilts as a process of finding combinations of colors and patterns that pleased their eye. These quilts are art because the women of Gee's Bend had an intentional vision. They were composing artworks by putting pieces of various fabrics together, no differently than the other artists in the show would compose a painting or an assemblage. This is from curator Amelia Peck, who worked at the Met. Additionally, from Huntington's exhibition description, when they showed the quilts, they described it as, Gee's Bend, Alabama is home to one of the most important African-American quilt making traditions in the United States. Quilting began there by the 19th century when enslaved women sewed quilts for themselves and as quilters passed down memory, skill, and meaning from generation to generation. They developed both individual and collective artistic practices unique to the community. Their works, which have been shown widely in museums over the past 2 decades, are celebrated for their soft geometries, bold juxtapositions of color, and inventive use of materials. So I do want you to take a good look at this for a second. I want you to think about what I've been talking about, the pitfalls, the parts to highlight, and I want you to find for yourself 1 or 2 good examples of how these authors are talking about these quilts in a productive way, in a supported way. And I'll point out a few of what I like in a minute, but I want to give you a second to just look, and I'm going to take a sip of water. So I highlighted a few of the things I found most valuable. Personally, I really liked this emphasis on the intentionality of the maker. I liked the way in which it's validating that this, although this is not a tradition we might see in museums all the time, it is certainly one that calls to other parts of museum life and museum work. I liked the emphasis on community, the ways in which these are objects of community. And I also really felt strongly about the descriptions of object, about the way that they're talking about color, line, shape, proportion, as a way of highlighting the importance, right? They're falling back on the objects themselves and the people that made them, rather than reaching too far outward from really focusing in on why these objects are beautiful, inherently valuable, and interesting within our collection. Again, these will all be up, so you can go back and poke through this in more detail later. So for our interpretive focus, the ways in which these, we're going to really highlight the ways in which these objects are rich examples of creativity, craftsmanship, and innovation, qualities that honestly we should be looking for in artwork across our museum. When possible, I want you to really focus on reading the words from the women that made the objects. Think about the ways they're talking about them and use that to really strengthen your own work. The artist's intention is visible in the way that they describe their own practice. And rather than viewing these as exceptional moments of creative genius, the quilters of Gee's Bend have really emphasized that importance of community in their works, drawing attention to the ways in which many critical, underrepresented art histories within the United States have remained unhighlighted in our museums. Not only are these quilts visually appealing, but they tell stories of survival and subsistence living, of community building and mutual aid, and of the power of personhood found in the act of quilting. Additionally, with this object, or with these objects, we have a few other objects in the gallery that we'll get to look at a little bit later. They're permanent collection objects, so we have a traditional star pattern quilt, which I mentioned. We have some crazy quilts from the 19th century, a popular form that sort of has freewheeling geometry in it as well. I'm happy to give you a little bit more about those later. And we also have this wonderful Faith Ringgold quilt, which you're seeing here, which is part of her series on story quilts. As a Black artist, she wanted to highlight the connection between fine arts and quilts as a way of making them more accessible. And that makes this object a great bridge for us to use as well in our thinking about how do we equate and make these objects flow into the larger presentation of the museum. So her work, which is right near the exit towards contemporary, is a great bridge piece if you're looking for an anchor for something, for one of your tours or for your own thought about this space. As a note, it's important for me to say this, these objects may rotate out depending a little bit on how decisions are made in the curatorial department. I don't know about any of this yet, but I will let you know as soon as I know if these are going to change, but keep a weather eye out. Some of these things may pop in and out, not the 5 quilts, the 5 quilts are staying, but the other objects around them may circulate over the course of the next few months. I will tell you if that happens, I promise. So it's important to pop for a few minutes to think about another part of the museum that has an intrinsic relationship to what we are talking about today. So we're going to take a moment to think about Alexandria Smith and Liz Gray's installation work, which should be up until June of 2023 or mid next year. This is an installation. I'm sure many of you have already seen this. It's wonderful. It's been up in our space for a little while. It is called Memoirs of Ghost Girlhood, A Black Girl's Window. And this installation space helps speak to several concepts that are personally really important to Alexandria Smith, including themes like dreams or dreamlike worlds, her own adolescence as a young Black woman, and feelings of freedom and self-actuation and self-awareness. So you can find visual themes all throughout this with symbols like the female body or nighttime, which is partially symbolized by that really great sparkling Black glittery wallpaper that unites the whole installation. For Smith's part, this installation addresses the question of, quote, how can one imagine oneself in the future of a past in which one has been invisible? So it's focusing on themes of visibility and invisibility and the perception of the self. Smith, in order to create this installation, did a lot of research into different historic sites, but also really looked inward into her own experience in the space and how she felt and how she wanted to bring a viewer into the narrative of her own life and her own vision of this dream world. So that's really what she's trying to do with this installation, is invite you into her own space for a few moments to think about what the world through her perspective would have been like. And this helps the viewer sort of share in some of the wonder or confusion or sadness or joy that she experienced as a young Black woman growing up. This is paired with this really wonderful piece of audio art by Liz Gray, which you can hear in the space. There's that big white speaker in the ceiling. That's what's playing out of that. And it is part of the installation, 2 artists collaborating together to build this immersive experience. The audio is an original composition that incorporates similar themes of surrealism, nighttime, and the self. As part of this process, both Liz and Alexandria went to the Black Heritage Trail in Portsmouth, and they really enjoyed being in a space which I don't know, some of you probably know, some of you may not, but they are currently in the process of reinterpreting a historically Black graveyard in Portsmouth that was undiscovered for many years. And going to the space really emphasized for the artists an emotional connection, and part of the nature noise in the audio from Liz Gray is actually recorded on site. at the Heritage Trail. So we're hearing an inclusion that is very much site specific. Additionally, in this booth, which is sort of off to the side, there's the windowed piece, which Liz Gray is inviting people to call a phone number and leave a message about their experience in the museum as a Black person. And over time, she will incorporate those audio pieces into that audio artwork. So just be warned, it may change as we go, and that would be a wonderful way of enlivening the space and continuing to make that more immersive. So when you're working with art installations, I want to emphasize a few things. Firstly, this is how I would approach working with an audience in an immersive installation. Primarily, emphasize the active qualities of the space. Give people time to look. Give them time to listen. It's meant to be immersive, and that requires a little patience. So let people sit in the space, hear the audio, and feel what's going on around them for a little while. It's meant to be a space that's transportive and very narratively driven. So allow people to imagine themselves to be somewhere else and invite them to make their own stories about what is going on in this area. To do that, I would recommend activating people's senses. So when they're in this space, ask them what they see and hear, and then ask them what they think they could be smelling or feeling if they were in this sort of dream world. How would they imagine themselves interacting with this space? To push that forward, look for symbols. What does the artist include that helps tell their story? So what does the use of the starry wallpaper or the clouds tell us about how the space would feel? And what does that tell us about the sort of narrative that she's building? So you can really build outward from this initial observation into much more detailed personal experiences of this area. And that should really invite creative participation from your audience. You can ask them questions once they sort of have gotten into a little bit of a reflective mode about what else could the artist have included? What would enhance this immersive experience? I know I had campers in there over the summer, and one of the students volunteered that he wanted the whole floor covered in like turf grass, because he was thinking about looking up at the night sky and laying on grass. And that added to his experience of the space and his understanding of this built environment. And that's what you want to do, is activate this as a unified space, not as individual artworks, but as a complete whole. It's really important that we continue to think about the ways in which our objects and exhibitions are connected to each other. So I want to take a second to think about some institutional connections with these shows. This is important because we need to continue to think about how the Currier builds narrative across exhibitions. So if we wanted to go from Alexandria Smith to Gee's Bend and back and forth, we can highlight three important elements. The Currier, like many museums, has a critical need to highlight Black voices in our galleries. And this is wonderful because we have Black artwork spanning from almost 100 years, 1925 to 2022, up on our walls right now, 100 years of Black art and makership in the United States. What a wonderful moment. Number two is that inclusion of storytelling about home, comfort, or childhood. So both Alexandria Smith, who's thinking about her experiences as a young Black girl, and the Gee's Bend quilts, which are made in communities that support the growth and education of young women, share this moment of childhood learning and community learning. And finally, these are all objects of collaborative origin. The quilts are made in community, they're made by multiple hands, they're taught through generations, and Alexandria Smith and Liz Gray worked together to build this immersive space. So we're seeing Black community collaboration, Black creativity, and the history of art form really highlighted across these two exhibitions. This carries over into ways that we could link this into our contemporary space. For instance, thinking about three different highlights: the use of color field paintings. So the object I have up, Rotunda Unwound, which is the Sam Gilliam work, is made by a Black artist. It's a color field textile. And all of those things are a good way of building a relationship between a modern art practice that uses bright colors and textiles with this historic practice of quilt making. So there is a good responsible relationship because it highlights the ways in which these artistic practices bridge different groups and different time periods across American art history. Briefly, we're also going to touch on what is coming next. There will be more information about this later, I promise. This is a brief touch. So if you are confused or have questions, don't worry. we will let you know as we get closer. One of the fall trainings will be specifically about this show. So, State of the Art Locate is opening on October 20th, 2020. From the Crystal Bridges, the show is traveling to us from Crystal Bridges, a modern art museum. And it deals with themes of identity, placemaking, the self and society, and uses a bunch of mixed media, which notably, very similar to some things we've already been talking about today. This piece is a 10-foot tall plush dinosaur made out of felt by Jung Che that speaks to her experiences as a Korean American and that identity development where she has sort of created an inner world to explore her life. And those are themes we'll see across the show. Not only do we have monumental sculpture, but we also have photography and two-dimensional work. So this is from Frank Blazquez, who is exploring his Chicano-American identity by photographing members of his community in their daily life activities. We also have some more abstracted work. Karen Siepker thinks about ideas of interiority and motherhood. So she had a child that really changed her perspective on the world, becoming a mother, as I think many people can identify with. Parenthood made her see things differently. And so she paints about feelings of guardianship, about safety, and about the role of motherhood. So we'll see a few of her works in the show as well. And there'll be some other monumental sculptural pieces. This includes a soundscape, so there'll be sound in the galleries. This is by a woman named Sama Al-Shaibi and speaks to histories of female suppression in Iraq and the Middle East. So there'll be some big, intense themes in this show, some more quiet themes, and we're going to link it all together by thinking about how people experience themselves in the places they live, whether they feel safe in their communities, how they feel seen in their communities, all of which should link back to the shows of Alexandria Smith's work, as well as the G-Spent quilt. So we're going to experience this really wonderful moment of continuity in the museum this fall. So in a few minutes, we're going to pop upstairs and we're going to be doing some tour form reminders. So before we do that, I want to run really quickly through the 3 forms of tours that we give and think about them as each containing a beginning, a middle, and an end. So again, the slide will be up online for you later. For our 30-minute tours, your beginning, which is like our art after work tours, anything where you're really anchored in a gallery. For those 30-minute tours, really start with a grounded introduction. Establish where you are and what you're looking at. In the middle of the tour, make sure you're both providing relevant content and allowing for expansive questioning. And then for this one, your wrap-up is pretty expensive. You want to send people out with a new perspective. You want to activate a new sense of what they're looking at so that when they go back into the museum, they feel like they're seeing things again in a new way. So you're building towards a new sense of space. For our looking togethers, our 15-minute tours, start off by explaining that activity, explaining what the activity will be, but you don't need to offer too much information off the bat, maybe only the title and the artist. Keep the talking short there so that you can hear what your audience wants to say about this artwork. Allow for the group to really move between ideas, but here's the challenge for you all: keep track of what they're saying. Store those nuggets away as you move between topics, and then bring them back for your closeout. When you are moving on, when you're sending people away, bring back those great observations from your audience to validate their experience and to make them feel like they really got something from what they were looking at. So they walk away feeling like they've been educated, eddied, and rewarded for looking at art carefully with you. And finally, our gallery guide component. I know this may be weird to think about beginning, middle, and end, but it also has a beginning, middle, and end. And we'll practice this upstairs, but first of all, make an initial comment or observation. You don't have to ask a question. You can honestly just say something brief and observational that somebody could choose to respond to. The key with gallery guides is allowing people to opt in and opt out on their own basis, by their own desire, right? So you want to invite participation, but not keep somebody sort of cornered with you for too long, unless that's what they want. If that's what they want, go for it. And you do that in the middle by providing an exit sort of after every piece of information. So allow people to opt in or out of the next part of a conversation. And when they do move on, politely sort of allow them to move on, whether it's been short or long, they got what they wanted. And that is what is important, that somebody feels positively like they've been informed and not like they need to quickly move away. So really make sure that you're allowing people to move on when they're ready. They'll let you know if they want to keep talking. I know that might be a little confusing. So part of what we're going to do is practice, practice, practice. So we're actually going to head upstairs. We're going to take a little break, and then we're actually going to be dividing up into 3 groups to do 3 different short activities in our galleries. So station 1, and we'll divide you up when we get up there. Carolyn is going to be going into contemporary, and it will be about our 15-minute looking together. So you'll be able to, as a group, hopefully try out some open-ended questions, make some observations, and get some feedback from your peers. I will be doing some gallery guide conversations with people, as well as giving a little more information about Alexandria Smith and Liz Gray's work. So we'll be in that space. And the 3rd group, you're going to be on your own in the Gee's Bend area, thinking about what 3 objects you would put together for a 30-minute tour. And I want you to consider what links them, what themes you would want to focus on, and sort of see what your group might want to emphasize about the space. We'll rotate through them as we go, and then at the end, hopefully we'll come back together and be able to share some observations. So that is the end of our downstairs portion. We're gonna have a little bit of a break and head upstairs. So we are just coming up on the end of the hour. I want to make sure that you have a little bit of time to get some drinks, snacks, whatnot. But I also want to make sure if you have questions and would like to ask those now, you're also more than welcome to. So I am, yes.
So I have a question.
Yes.
That quilt making is a very normal activity for all kinds of women for centuries.
Yes.
So one of the slides said 19th century. They've been making quilts probably since the Middle Ages.
Yes.
And, my great grandmother from West Virginia, certainly she made tons of quilts. And during the Depression, my grandmother made baby clothes for my father out of her old stage costumes and stuff. So that's a connecting thing, but it's so I felt maybe highlighting the G-Brand people felt isolated, and I think they're with the rest of the country making quilts.
Yeah, so exactly. So they have a tradition that is unique to them, but it certainly is part of this huge number of different traditions. And I'm sure it relates in many ways, right? That reuse of fabric that you're talking about, the sort of inventive make do attitude about, well, we have these, we need new blankets, let's do this.
I just wanted it to not be the other, but the same.
Exactly. So
between people.
I think if you want to, please emphasize how this is one of many traditions, right? It has unique markers because of the way it's developed in its community, but it certainly shares much more than it separates.
Yeah.
In terms of that continuity across the country and our history, as you pointed out. Yes.
Well, this is before your time here, we had a wonderful show by Casey Morosky about the history of the Amherst Mills and the textile,
Mhm.
and mostly farm girls came in collaboration with many other ethnic groups. And I'm going to stick my neck out here and hope that perhaps in context of what we're going to do with these books, that the reference might be made
If you,
to that whole experience, which is a written part of the city's history and covers many ethnic groups, admittedly not so much African Americans, that's for sure. But anyhow.
And
No.
the denim,
and there's denim, one of the quotes is denim.
Trinity making,
Yes.
because the historical guy said that they switched from making, I don't know, locomotive parts to making denim at some point, and who remembers that much? No, okay,
It's not making choo-choo trains and make dumb movies.
yeah,
So-
so they repurpose the mills here, whatever they need.
I heard Henry Melville Ford's family became super wealthy with those choo-choo trains.
Yes, please. If that works for your group, if that's part of where you want to go, that would be great. I would love to hear people talk about the ways in which textiles are part of the history of the city and how that builds into the way that we collect and think about art. Absolutely, that would be a wonderful direction to move in with a tour. Yes.
Yeah, it also ties in with the exhibit that we just had on the rugs.
because it's an industry dominated by women. Totally. And yet, I mean, the beautiful artistic results. I mean, we were all blown away by those rugs. And again, you know, there's another artistic expression done by women over the centuries, as you pointed out. And the other thing that it brought to my mind is we had discussions when we had the pottery exhibits about the transition from craft making to art. And these quilts are making the transition from craft making to art and are being recognized now as a legitimate expression, just like painting, of someone's emotions and experience and all those other aspects. So we have a strong history with these kinds of objects.
Absolutely. And again, part of this is an ongoing effort by the Currier and a number of other museums to really try to shrink that gap between the idea of art and craft, and to think about the ways in which that differentiation has been used to build arbitrary, often discriminatory differences, right? So absolutely, we are watching these objects in real time be recognized as both a craft practice and an artistic practice. So absolutely, yes, please build that in, talk about the way that this relates to other forms, potteries, textiles of other types, love it. Yes, follow up.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I mean, your presentation was great. However, there were 100 places where I would have loved to ask questions.
Sorry, yes.
And one of the questions I would love to ask is, how many quilts do we have in our collection? Is everything on the walls right now? Okay, that's a good shaking your head there. Will we see some more of them over this period of time?
Asking really great questions. So I know we have a good number of quilts in the permanent collection. Given my relative newness, I don't actually know the number of quilts we have. There are currently 3 or 4 quilts up on the in the gallery. As I said, Curatorial has said that they're open to moving things around. They may decide to do that. I will let you know if that happens, when I know if that happens. But the 5 G's Bend quilts are the 5 that we acquired. They will stay up. They are marked. I mean, you'll remember what they look like, I'm sure, but if you ever forget, they are marked G's Bend quilt above the label. There's a little additional label on them, just to help you or visitors, whoever really identify with them. Those will stay. The other objects might vary a little. There are a few other quilts that might come up into that space. I don't actually know the number, though I'm happy to find that out for you, and I can let you know down the road how many quilts we actually have in collection.
And one more
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
This is something that I like, which obviously you wouldn't know yet, but I like to know why and how we acquired these.
So they're a purchase. We purchased them, I believe. And they partially because they are representative of a type of artwork and a group of makers that we don't have a ton of work from. And so they're really filling in. As you notice, the collection and the exhibitions have been moving forward towards that material. So we are looking to highlight the ways in which these connect to the larger collection. I was not personally involved in the decision-making about these objects, but I do think regardless, they fit really nicely in with what we are looking at in the future and what we're trying to sort of build the collection towards. So I would suspect that these were acquired. Some of them might have been a gift. I don't remember. Yes, Julie? Great. Half and half as a way of filling out the collection to be more complete in areas where we want to build meaning right now. And as I pointed out, like these relate to histories of female makership and textiles, histories of craft, which we have a wonderful collection of pottery and glass and all of this wonderful material. And so it fits really nicely into that larger narrative. And over the last 20 years, these quilts really have gained a lot of international attention as part of building an American art collection. So they're very exciting for us to have acquired them. And I really hope that they are a signal of us building forward along this pathway in terms of collecting practices.
So the women were making the quilts. I wondered what the men were making, maybe out of wood or something.
They're making trouble.
And Jill would. Jill would know.
If you're curious, there are the photos that I pulled for this are actually in the Library of Congress's collection from the Farm Workers Administration, the photography project. And they actually photographed quite heavily in Gee's Bend. So if you go onto the Library of Congress's website and search Gee's Bend, you'll actually find a huge collection of images, some with quilts, some without, that highlight the farming industries in the area, the construction work, this sort of wide variety of material, schoolhouses, and a lot of them come with commentaries. So you can actually find out a lot through that photographic resource about how people were managing their livelihoods in that area. But again, they were doing a lot in terms of animal husbandry, farming, and construction work. Everything that goes into a community, they did within that community. Yes.
I have a question. When we've been receiving art pieces from women,
Yes.
they have been emphasizing that they don't want to be considered women artists. They just want to be considered artists.
Yes.
We seem to be emphasizing black.
Yes. I think it's important to consider that that there is nothing shameful about being a female artist or a Black artist. I think to emphasize it helps highlight the ways in which it is part of the history of these objects. I mean, I wouldn't normally say that quite as heavily about a piece of art, but these objects come from a community where their status as a Black community is very much part of the makership of these items, right? So they're tied deeply into the civil rights movement. They're tied deeply into this nature of their community. I think in your personal interpretation, you can choose how much you want to discuss that or highlight other options. What I would avoid doing is equating them with other types of Black art just to equate them. But I do think it's important that people are encouraged to recognize that we do have diverse narratives on our museum walls, and that we are talking about people who come from a historically Black community. So I'm happy to discuss this at length. I'm happy to think about it a little bit more. But I would say that it's about balance. It's not about never mentioning it, but I would include it in the way that you're discussing them. Part of why these objects were acquired is that they're made by Black individuals. Part of why they're important within our art history is their identity. I think, yes, in many cases, you don't want to say that this object is important just because a woman made it, or this artist is different because they're a woman. But in some cases, if being a woman is part of why an artwork is important, being made by a woman is part of the narrative of the artwork, then it's important to mention it so the audience sort of understands that element of its identity. So it's about sort of, I think, balancing the identity of the artwork against not wanting to be reductive. So I hear you, and I don't want it to become like, well, these are just here because they're made by Black people, but I would definitely emphasize that there's something important about these as objects that are made by a Black community. It's a tough balance to strike, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as we go. Yes.
I spent a little too much time yesterday on SC.
Mhm.
Links to one of your articles,
Yep.
and I found that to be extremely touching about all of these women. I think there's about 20 women who are selling on SC for Gee's Bend. Some of the ones you mentioned today that are still alive, in their personal stories of years. I found it very touching and very informative.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. Please go poke around. The people that made these are very much active and often were interviewed or are speaking about themselves online. Go read that stuff. Go see how they're talking about themselves and let that help inform your presentation about them and the way that you approach it. The best source is always the artists themselves. So read. Yes.
Well, following up on Pam, I mean, if you start linking all over the place, if one of those sites pops up, and you get like half a dozen, 12, just keeps going. You can spend a day watching either YouTubes or films or, just lots and lots about these people. I go back to the idea of the Currier as a museum of art. Because I'd certainly be hoping that the quilts were also acquired because they were art,
Yes.
not because, well, we've got to show some Black people doing something.
No, right.
So it's an art museum that has become now at least an art form.
Yes.
And it's in the whole area of
of folk art and outsider art. And, you know, was very in the early 2000s and before that.
Yeah.
So it's just part of our collection from that point of view.
Right, exactly. We're building a collection. And so we are filling in gaps and highlighting what's necessary. But for something to be brought into the museum, it has to sort of fall into that consideration, right? I mean, we're not taking these in just to put a flag in the ground. We're really thinking about them as artistic objects that have merit and value, and also help fill our collection in so that it is more complete in terms of what we consider art. As our definition of it has expanded, we have to expand our collection to match that changing view of art histories. So yeah, this is a big part of us becoming, us adapting our collection to be more sympathetic to the modern idea of what art is. So absolutely. Anything else? I'm happy to continue to answer questions. I know it's a lot of information, but please get in touch with me and we're happy to revisit, to chit chat, to clarify, whatever it is, happy to sort of touch base with you on that. But we are going to head upstairs. So I want you to give a good few minutes for you to sort of hang out, and I'll meet you up in the Giesben Gallery in about 10 minutes.